minutes. Then we will have the panelists, and each panelist will have 7 minutes. And then we will have a special guest speaker after the panelists, also 7 minutes. And then we will close out with the discussants. We have 2 discussants listed on your program. They will each have 4 minutes. But I've just been advised that the discussant from Bhutan, who was going to speak to us on gross national happiness, that's Ms. Tashi Choden. She isn't online, so I think we may end up with just 1 discussant. So, as I said, we have a keynote speaker. That's going to be the first person you will hear from. He is Maximo Torero, and Maximo is the chief economist of the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and he's going to be speaking to us virtually. Before joining the FAO, he was the World Bank Group Executive Director for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. His major research work lies in analyzing poverty, inequality, the importance of geography and assets, and when I say assets, I mean both public and private assets, and their importance in explaining poverty. And he's also looking at policies that are oriented towards the alleviation of poverty. So I'll just leave it at that and give Maximo Torero the floor. Maximo.
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can hear me well.
Muted? Great, we can.
Okay, great. So let me share my screen and my presentation so that we can, I hope you can see it now. So thank you so much for this kind invitation. My presentation will focus on eradicating poverty and hunger and reducing inequality in the least developed countries. Today, what we observe is a situation where, well before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were already not on track to meet our commitments to end world hunger and malnutrition in all its forms by 2030. And the pandemic has made things significantly more challenging. One of the key questions that we want to answer is, how did the world get to this critical point? And clearly, there are major drivers behind this. Of course, the COVID pandemic is related to what we called economic slowdowns and downturns, which we knew before could significantly affect hunger. But also, we have challenges on climate variability and extremes, and of course, conflict. And one of the other outputs, which is a different level, is the issue of the cost and affordability of healthy diets. And what we are observing is that the cost of affordability of healthy diets is a significant challenge today. We have around 3 billion people that cannot have access to healthy diets today. So those are the key drivers that we have observed, and all of them have been affecting and has been exacerbated by the presence of COVID-19. Now, when we look at the exact numbers, we find that between 720 and 811 million people in the world face hunger in 2020. So the increase is up to 61 more million people than in 2019. Of course, if we take the upper limit, which is where we believe we are moving, we put a range because there is still uncertainty, even by 2020, of the potential impacts, because there is not yet latest information on that, but that's the range where we feel comfortable. But the increase of 161 million people more than in 2019 is extremely alarming. Nearly 2.37 billion people did not have access to adequate food in 2020, an increase of 320 million people in just 1 year. No region of the world was being spared. Due to the impacts of COVID-19, about 30 million more people may face hunger in 2030 than if the pandemic had not occurred, revealing the persistent effects of the pandemic on global food security. Greater inequality in access to food is mostly responsible for the observed differences. High and persistent levels of inequality further exacerbate food insecurity, and millions of people around the world suffer from food insecurity and different forms of malnutrition because they cannot afford the cost of healthy diets, as I mentioned before. And again, climate variability and extremes and economic slowdowns and downturns, also exacerbated by COVID-19, are behind the recent increase, this huge increase in hunger and malnutrition. Now, when we do projections, and this is a projection done with a sophisticated general equilibrium model, so that we can try to be as close as possible to the reality. And these projections take into account the COVID-19 pandemic, and it suggests that following a peak of more than 760 million people in 2020, global hunger will decline slowly to fewer than 660 million in 2030. Nevertheless, this represents tens of millions more people than projected for 2030 had the pandemic not occurred, revealing possible lasting effects of the pandemic. So in each of the different lines, you will see the dotted line, which is the projected with the pandemic, and so the space line, and then the dotted line under, which is the projection without the pandemic. A substantial reduction in hunger is projected for Asia by 2030, but a significant increase is forecasted for Africa. And this will place Africa on par with Asia by 2030 as a region with the highest number of undernourished people. Hunger will not be eradicated by 2030 unless bold actions are taken to accelerate progress, especially actions to address inequality in access to food. And it's important to mention that the negative effects of COVID-19 on Africa still are to come, and it will depend substantially on how fast they can move on the vaccination process. Now, referring specifically to least developed countries, we see that the SDG indicator 2.1.1, the prevalence of undernourishment, has also increased, consistent to what I have been showing before, to 23.1% in 2020, which is 2% higher than in 2014. Since 2014, the SDG indicator of the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity, this indicator 2.1.2, based on food insecurity experience scale, has also increased, so which give us confidence of the results we are showing today. And more than 1 out of 2 people is food insecure in least developed countries, 55.3% in 2020. This is incredible and is an enormous challenge to face and to resolve. And while their population constitutes only 13% of the global population, least developed countries host a quarter of the world's food insecure and a third of the world's hungry. Now, in the last 10 years, the frequency and intensity of conflict, climate variability, and extremes, and economic slowdowns and downturns have increased significantly. And the increased occurrence of these major drivers, now exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, has led to the rise of hunger and undernourishment progress in reducing all forms of malnutrition, particularly in low and middle income countries. 70% of low and middle income countries are affected by at least one of the drivers, and 41% also have high income inequality, which worsen their impact. The pandemic has shown the exacerbation of income inequality. And in low and middle income countries affected by these major drivers, the undernourishment indicator is higher and has increased, while it has decreased in countries not affected by any driver. The exception is in the year of COVID-19, when all countries saw an increase in the undernourishment, but still the increase were higher in countries when the pandemic impacts were combined with other drivers. The increase in the undernourishment in countries affected by these major drivers is especially pronounced since 2017, and between 2017 and 2019, the undernourishment has increased by 4% in countries affected with one or more of these major drivers, while it decreased by 3% in countries not affected by them. So high income inequality magnified this negative impact of the drivers, particularly in middle income countries, leading to POU, and increase were 2 times larger. And this is even extremely more important in regions where the informality is high. And we have seen this in Latin America, which we were not expecting to see the impacts that we have seen. And this is because 70% or 50% of their economies are informal, and because of the pandemic and because of the lockdown, they lose all their income sources and they have depleted the working capital, which has exacerbated the situation, and they were moving from a situation of non-poverty to poverty, of non-hunger to hunger. The only exception is Brazil, and it's because of the transfer programs, which allow them to increase substantially during the pandemic and reduce poverty, but hunger increased because they were not targeting people that were not poor, but had become poor because of the informality levels. Poverty, according to the bank, also has increased when we look at extreme poverty. The GDP contraction and the lockdowns increased poverty around the world, and the increase is around 97 million people in poverty in 2020. And this is extreme poverty. So again, the results are showing consistent to what we saw before. Now, globally, extreme poverty continues to be overwhelmingly rural, accounting for almost 4 in 5 people living in extreme poverty. And in fact, poverty became more rural between 2015 and 2018. And the share of the rural poor in the total population of poor people increased by more than 2% during this period. And as already highlighted, poverty and unemployment rates are increasing due to COVID-19 crisis, with the potential of deepening rural poverty as a result of the lack of remittances, disrupted supply chains, and many other effects as a result of this. We use also the multidimensional poverty, which is also more concentrated in rural areas. 1.1 billion of the world's 1.3 billion multidimensionally poor or 84.2% live in rural areas, which brings the importance of rural areas. And in low-income countries, recent survey data indicates that for every 100 urban residents who complete secondary school, only 23 rural residents do so. Nutritional status and dietary habits are often worse in rural areas, and the presence of stunting is higher in rural areas and in poorest households. So there is no way we can build back better if we don't focus on rural areas and if we don't focus on agriculture. In least developed countries, the agricultural sector employs more than half of the population and constitutes the primary income source for rural areas. However, food insecurity remains high, and their dependence on food imports is increasingly imports of agriculture and food products, which have risen more than fivefold between 2020 and 2019. Access to education, especially women and girls, is still slow. In 2019, 16.2% of children in primary school age were out of school in least developed countries. And the share of girls out of primary school as a percentage of female primary school age was 17.89% in 2019, more than double the world average of 8.95%. So least developed countries are also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, threatening livelihoods of the rural poor, as I have mentioned before. And there is options to work with digital technologies and digital finance, but again, there is an important role of the problem of capabilities that we need to overcome, and also in terms of access to be able to achieve that. 70% of rural population has no mobile coverage at all, and 19% of rural population is only covered by 2G networks. So a significant gap in access, in content, and in capabilities. So monetary poverty has increasingly concentrated in least developed countries in the last 10 years, and it was estimated in 2020 half of the world extreme poor live in least developed countries, as it has been shown in the graph that we see here. Now, one of the mechanisms in which, as FAO, we are working to cope with this is what we call the hand-in-hand initiative. And it's an example of a designed and implemented program to address all the challenges that we are facing using systems-oriented transformation as an opportunity to achieve multiple objectives, unlock co-benefits, and identify and manage trade-offs across SDGs in hand-in-hand initiative. And is developed by FAO. The hand-in-hand initiatives defines target interventions in areas with high poverty, yet high untapped agricultural potential, grounded in rigorous generated evidence that informs the process, using integrated geospatial, biophysical, and socioeconomic analysis and agri-food system lens to identify subnational territories where the agronomic potential is sufficient to drive and sustainable agricultural and rural transformation, including the identification of concrete agricultural sectors that are most socioeconomically cost-effective and should be prioritized. It focuses on the most vulnerable, hence LDCs are at the core of the initiative. And today, 45 countries are part of these hand-in-hand initiatives, which 30 are least developed countries, which is one of the criteria behind the hand-in-hand initiative. Hand-in-hand also analyzes and addresses all types of social and territorial inequalities in order to avoid perpetuating them or excluding vulnerabilities and marginalized groups. And some concrete examples of hand-in-hand include in Bangladesh, where we are doing an agricultural transformation program, includes Eritrea, where FAO supports value chain development, includes Nepal. Also, we are working in risk in countries which are recovering from conflict. In Sudan, we are also supporting a transformation agency called ALTA, and many others that we're trying to work. Hand-in-hand least developed countries are Afghanistan, Angola, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Chad, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Kiribati, Lao, PDR, Malawi, Mali, Mozambique, Nepal, Niger, Rwanda, São Tomé, Philippe, Senegal, Solomon Islands, Somalia, Sudan, Tanzania, Tuvalu, Uganda, and Yemen. All of this is a country-led initiative, is country-driven initiative, and these are all the 45 countries that are part of this hand-in-hand initiative. With that, sir, let me finish. I'm sorry I went 1.5 minutes more, but it's really important that we starting to understand these challenges for the agri-food system transformation, so that we can try at least to put us on track and on path to achieve SDG 1 and 2 and SDG 10, which is reduction of inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maximo. I don't know about you, but my goodness, those statistics are frightening. I mean, he throws so much data on us. I couldn't capture all of them. But some of the information, 1 million more people undernourished today than in 2019. More than 1 out of 2 people are food insecure in LDCs. 97 million more people are in poverty today, well, are in poverty since 2020. I mean, I was thinking to myself, how do you address all of that? And I think we all need to get a copy of his presentation because I couldn't even capture all the statistics. But I know right at the end there, he spoke about some of the strategies to get out of this problem, targeting the poorest, creating partnerships, providing a strategic framework, matchmaking. So, he was trying to point the direction because, I think 80% of his presentation was the house is on fire, you know, and at the end, there were some strategies about how to douse that fire. But I don't know about you, but I need to have a hard copy of that presentation and actually to absorb it. So let me just move on now to our next panelist, Martin Mwale. Which one of you is Martin? You kind of look like brothers, you're Martin, okay. So Martin is a final year PhD student at the economics department of Stellenbosch University. He's a development economist by profession and has worked with the government of Malawi as a monitoring and evaluation specialist. And Martin will present his paper that is entitled Long-Term Child Nutrition, the complementary relationship between the Malawi farm input subsidy vouchers and healthcare quality. Martin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so this presentation just falls in with the previous, which has just gone about nutrition. So I will not do a lot of background talk because that one has just given a good background of what I wanted to say. But I'll just begin to say 145.3 million children under the age of 5 are stunted in the world as of now. But this statistic was given even before the COVID pandemic. And we know now food prices are skyrocketing in LDCs, which means if we collect data now, the situation should be worse. In Malawi, during the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, malnutrition improved. From 50% stunting, it shifted, of course, to 40%. But then that stride is not enough than what we anticipated as to what is invested in trying to combat the malnutrition. So in this particular paper, I tried to show that it's the limited focus, which is just on the first 1,000 days of life without checking interventions beyond, which has led to the fight against malnutrition, particularly stunting, to be slower than anticipated. But there's hope, as I'll show in the results. So in Malawi, as it's one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa which is implementing the large-scale farm input subsidies, where they are targeting poor farmers, providing them cheap vouchers to obtain cheap fertilizer and maize seed. This has shown to improve maize output. And it has also shown to improve child nutrition, however, only short-term child nutrition. So we cannot rely on these short-term benefits. We need a solution to go beyond short-term child nutrition. So I examined height for age, long-term child nutrition in this particular paper. And I see that there's hope. It's possible to positively shift height for age. What is known is that what is not known is whether we can still use this subsidy in combination with other interventions to improve height for age. What is not known is which interventions can really do this job. So this paper investigated this. First of all, I tried to examine in areas where children are living, if a health facility in that community administered focused antenatal care. By the way, focused antenatal care has got a bunch of good information which provides to pregnant women about their diets and the diets of the children. But globally, in high-income countries, the adoption of this program or the utilization by the people, it's 98%. In low-income countries, 60%. In Malawi, 12%. But actually, it's the one which I'm seeing in my study that it's doing a big deal in combination with a farm input subsidy to increase child nutrition. So there are benefits we can live with if we can push low-income countries to adopt such kind of programs. And then I showed that, of course, this has got temporary benefits. If we just stop it there, we're still not going to attain the long-term child nutrition. But there should be other complementary programs beyond the first 1,000 days of life to sustain this positive trend. So I show that the in utero nutrition benefits provided through the focused antenatal care, they dissipate after 3 years if no complementation is done. So what we are saying is we should adopt an ecological approach to provision of care and services to children. Target the proximal factors. Yes, let's relieve poverty. As we are relieving poverty, the situation of the children will improve because of the improvement of their families. But in their communities, let's also set programs such as the focused antenatal care, which is only at 12%, but it's showing me that it's improving child nutrition in combination with the farm input subsidy. If we can boost this at least maybe to 50% or beyond in Malawi or in other low-income countries, the situation should be different. So let's now bolster the entire life curve of nutrition if we have to reap permanent benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Very efficient use of your time. Now, I know he's not your brother because he's also called Martin, and that would be bizarre if both of you call. But we're going to have continue with our next panelist, Martin Paul Jr. Tabio Zhang. He's a doctoral researcher at the Institute for Food and Resource Economics at the University of Bonn. He will be joining the International Food Policy Research Institute this November as an associate research fellow based in Cairo. And he will be presenting on agricultural commercialization and smallholder poverty, implications for asset ownership and rural wealth. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the very kind. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you very, very much for the kind introduction. And I find it very interesting to be here to virtually take you to Ethiopia and talk about agricultural commercialization and how this relates to smallholder poverty. I'm looking at rural ownership and rural wealth. So this is work I did with Michael Hauser and Kai Mausch. At the time, both of them were the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in Kenya. So I hope you'll be able to stick with me for the next 7 minutes as I do this. So by way of motivation, poverty, and that's why we're here, continues to be an issue in many developing countries. And if we look at kind of the headline causes of poverty, basically would just generally classify this into two, kind of internal and external constraints. And a lot of efforts have been put to talk about external constraints, looking at things to do with health, malnutrition, and more or less now COVID, but also internal constraints of poverty also exist, things to do with aspirations, things to do with hopes, things to do with improving the mental models and capacity of households. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about some external constraints of poverty, looking at structural transformation, basically. So in most agrarian countries, agriculture continues to be very important for these countries. And this is the case of Ethiopia, where agriculture continues to take central stage. And if we're talking about key strategies on structurally improving agriculture, especially in a country like Ethiopia, as was ratified by the Istanbul Program of Action, agricultural transformation or economic transformation takes central stage. And key to agricultural transformation or structural transformation is this whole aspect about smallholder commercialization. So are we able to move farmers from looking at agriculture not just as a way of life, but looking at agriculture as kind of a means to an end. So moving them from low productivity subsistence agriculture to high productivity market-oriented agriculture. And this is what I try to do in this study. So basically, we understand basically smallholder commercialization and how this relates to poverty. And in a way, we make a case for considering welfare or poverty, not just from an income or consumption perspective, but also more or less from an asset or from a livestock perspective, especially in a pastoral community like Ethiopia or in even other regions of Africa, where households basically after a harvesting period kind of get a lot of income, but just invest directly into livestock. And in doing that, we test how smallholder commercialization leads to kind of amassments in assets, but also investments in livestock. And like I said, so key in this study is that we move beyond just looking at income, but also looking at assets, but also not just looking at the average effects. So kind of, it's always a case that we always want to make short decisions about heterogeneity. So what happens to different classes of people or different groups of people in the subpopulation? So that is what I'm going to be talking in the next slide. So basically, looking at the results, we see that Africa is rising. Ethiopia is rising when it comes to smallholder commercialization. Smallholder commercialization is increasing because we used the panel data set where we could observe a lot of dynamics, and it's increasing, but then we still get that households are not still participating in the markets. And what are the constraining factors? So key constraining factor, it's transaction cost. Not just transaction cost, but also lack of the necessary inputs. Things to do with farm inputs, things to do with improved seeds, things to do with fertilizers. Also, we find that commercialization increases savings in assets, but not just savings in assets, but also in livestock, and also generally more broadly income. And in all this, we do not just consider poverty looking at assets, but also we looked at it on a per capita basis, so getting to each individual in the household. And we find that smallholder commercialization, which like I said, is increasing, basically improves welfare, looking at income, looking at assets, looking at livestock ownership. And looking at now the heterogeneous relationship, we'd also find that among different asset groups, among different income groups, smallholder commercialization is increasing in these various groups. But then the key tricky thing is the fact that the benefits are largest for the asset-rich and the income-rich households. And this is intuitive, right? Because if we are talking about smallholder commercialization and we're arguing that transaction costs really matter, households which have kind of improved, or households which have cars, kind of good mechanized cars that can transport their products to the market, would definitely participate more in markets as opposed to households that are not asset-rich. And then directly, this is really policy-oriented and underscores that something needs to be done. There should be a big push given to these asset poor households to kind of get them to enjoy the benefits of smallholder commercialization. And this is what I'll be talking again in the next slides when I'm just basically building up on the policy implications. So firstly, it's clear already that smallholder commercialization is a significant entry and leveraging points for improving livelihoods, increasing welfare in Ethiopia. And I think it's never a one-fit-all hypothesis, but I think the findings from this study can be generalized, especially given that most smallholder households are kind of similar in the context, the policy environment are similar, kind of, it's a pastoral community, which is also the case in many pastoral communities, not just in East Africa, but also in West Africa, countries like Mali, where households are basically reliant on kind of amassing a lot of livestock. And the key thing is that saving in these assets and livestock could be seen as a buffering mechanism. So in terms of shocks like now in COVID, which has led to a lot of food insecurity, households could sell some of these assets to kind of improve on the food security. And key again is that some of these assets can basically, especially when we see that households who are into crop production begin to invest in livestock, it's a key rural diversification strategy for households. And given that there are a lot of disparities, especially when I look at the different classes, and you see that smallholder commercialization benefits more the asset-rich households, it's key that basically smallholder commercialization has some effects on inequality. And one could just say that, it kind of leads to income or asset inequality. And what needs to be done, like I said, there should be a big push to these asset-poor households. And now coming to my last slide, but the key policy recommendations is that since we are arguing that smallholder commercialization is really important for boosting welfare, for reducing poverty, not just looking at income, but also assets and livestock, there should be the promotion of agricultural commercialization through two major ways. Firstly, there should be investments in rural market infrastructure, kind of, in a way, kind of improve the rural and feeder roads in many of these rural areas in Ethiopia, but also there should be the scaling and upscaling of market support schemes and programs that target productivity, programs that can lead households, that can take households from low productivity to high productivity. And just from both of them, I think the key highlight is the fact that there should be a lot of support, and most of this support should be about kind of the budgetary support. And like I said, smallholder commercialization is important. It improves welfare, but it's only going to be beneficial, or it's only going to be beneficial to all households in the cluster if the poor households can be given kind of a little boost. And kind of so far in the literature, the most common boost in lifting households out of poverty is this whole aspect of social protection, this whole aspect of cash transfers. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin Paul. And one of the things that when we open it up that you might want to think about is, because you said you could promote agricultural commercialization if the government would provide more budgetary support. And we know that a lot of governments are fiscally constrained. So how do they find the fiscal space? Is it really just a matter of reprioritizing where the scarce resources are being put to? So that's something that you could think of. So our third speaker before we open it up for questions is Mr. Kolawole Ogundare, who has more than 10 years of experience and exposure to multiple domains in qualitative and quantitative analysis and analytical research, consulting, and teaching. He's coming to us virtually and will present on the convergence of African agricultural total factor productivity, growth, and climate change impact, the implication on food security in the region. And he has 7 minutes. Kolawole, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you. Greeting from Seattle, Washington State in the US. Just a minute, please.
No, but that looks like the Golden State Bridge.
Okay, can you, I guess you can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, no, sorry, that's something. No, I'm not seeing it. Try it again, please, to share.
Okay, let me put it down again. Just
Okay, Kolawole, you speak. We will share it from our end, okay?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, we have it now.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I'll be talking. I think that was a mix-up somewhere. The title in the program is different from what I am presenting now. I think there was a change in the paper along the way. So basically, I'll be talking about what we call club convergence in income inequality in Africa. And next slide, please. So that's it. I think I need to, okay, you have it now. Okay. So basically the idea of this paper is to provide insight into evolution of income inequality in Africa. We all know that issue of income inequality is a significant concern in developing countries, including Africa. Most importantly, the fact that income inequality and poverty, they are two sides of the same coin. And the statistics have shown that 6 out of 10 countries with a high level of income inequality in the world are found in Africa. And it's not surprise, as I said earlier, the fact that Africa accounts for a large share of people living in absolute poverty in the world. So that the policymakers are also concerned, not only as previous speakers have spoken, when we talk about income inequality, we also talk about the issue of poverty. And we all know the consequence of having high income inequality, because it prevents equitable distribution of access to education and opportunity for people living in the low-income countries. It also has a negative impact on the economic prospect and growth of these people living in these countries. So the basic idea of this paper is to take a look at how the development of income inequality in Africa. There are quite a number of studies that have been designed, published, have been written over the years on the growth or the development or evolution of income inequality in Africa. Over the time, looking at the trends and the development, how this income inequality transit over a given period of time. But this study is taking a different perspective to look at this issue. So the idea is to look at whether the income inequality is actually growing, or probably say, is it increasing or decreasing across country in Africa? The basic idea of this particular paper is to use a kind of the conceptual framework that is very widely popular among the macroeconomics. We call it convergence hypothesis process. It's a neoclassical modeling used mostly by the growth economists to look at the development of GDP over a given period of time. So what we did in this paper is to use cross-country data in Africa. We use basically the Gini coefficient, and we form a kind of a panel data. We have a very weak data in terms of a year. So what we found that indeed, not surprising, the income inequality in Africa is divergent. There's a high level of divergence in income inequality. Now, what does that mean? It means that's a widening, that's an increase in income inequality over a given period of time. We use all sort of model. I don't really want to spend much time on that. That's not surprising. There are so many reports on that shows that income inequality is actually increasing in Africa. So next slide, please. So the same way we use different methods, we use different modeling, it's all the same conclusion. But this is what we are going to. That's not new. So the next slide, please. The next slide. So this is what we're going to. We found out that it is true, as two previous slides confirmed, that income inequality is actually widening up, it's increasing. But when we use another approach, we call the club clustering procedure, we found that it is not, that is not the story. The story is not exactly true. We found out that there are a group of countries in Africa. If you look at because we use two different Gini coefficient indices there. So we use the Gini coefficient that is based on the market income, and another one that is based on disposable income. One is based before the tax, and another one is based after the tax has been deducted. So we found out that why it is true across the country, but when we use the club clustering procedure, the story is different completely. It shows that there are similar group of countries. If you look at this last slide, you will notice that in the club one, we have a group of countries, like 5 countries in group 1, that actually converge. They exhibited convergence. That means that if you take this group of countries with the similar characteristics, we found out that over a given period of time, the income inequality is actually decreasing among them. The same thing with the group. So we found different 5 groups. That is also very important to the policymaker in Africa, that look, it is true, if you look at it for the whole country, for the whole region, it might be increasing, but if you look at them in a similar group of countries, it's actually decreasing. That is the key point in this particular presentation. Please, the next slide, please, the next slide. So what is the conclusion of these particular findings? It is true that we found evidence of divergence, but despite the fact that we found evidence of divergence, we still also find evidence of convergence. That is, there are a group of countries that are actually experiencing this declining and decreasing in the level of income inequality. And this means that if we are to achieve the SDG goal in Africa, there must be a targeted specific policies to target these particular countries to be able to address the issue of poverty or income inequality in Africa. So that we don't just assume that everybody is the same, that we have to probably pay attention to that. One of the policies to look at the issue of taxes and also those other important drivers that could help address this issue of income inequality in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Okenwale. So now, we have 3 more speakers, but I thought it would be best to just give you some interactive time. So we're going to open it up now for your observations, comments, or any questions you may have. Perks, you want? Let me have a microphone right here, please. Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's on. Thanks very much to all our panelists. My question really goes to Maximo Torero. The figures you have given us are threatening, very scaring, and my question is, the solutions you have given us are all included in the hand-in-hand initiative. You've mentioned just some countries that are implementing that initiative. I hope FAO is working on having that initiative all over the countries, LDC countries that may need that, and I know there are many. So the selection of your countries that you are operating in, can that be increased? The second part of the question is that hand-in-hand initiative enough to get our SDG target by 2030? What else do we need to do to get there if you are optimistic? And I see that the initiative is a good one because Malawi, I am from Malawi, is implementing that. How is FAO working together with other UN agencies and others so that this is addressed? I'm talking about this because financing is a very important element to resolve these problems. Are you working together with UNCDF, for example? And how do you intend to implement that in the new program of action, Doha program of action, to get to our 2030 target? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perks. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions in a group.
Okay. Yeah, Daniel Gay, I'm a consultant working on the LDCs, former inter-regional advisor with the UN on LDCs. So this is also a question for Maximo Torero. So in 2009, you wrote a paper with Von Braun about the idea of a physical and virtual reserve system to minimize speculative attacks on food markets for IFPRI. Would you be able to, do you still think this is a good idea? It seems particularly relevant at the current time as a specific measure directed at the LDCs, and given rising food prices right at the current juncture, do you think this is still relevant, and would you be able to say a little bit more about this system and this idea? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Maybe we can take one more before we turn it back over to the speakers. No. Okay. Maximo, you want to take those two questions?
Yeah,
The
yes,
ambassador
thank you.
from Malawi and then the second one there.
No, thank you very much, Ambassador of Malawi. The Hand-in-Hand initiative has a criteria for countries to be invited, and of course for countries to request to be part of Hand-in-Hand initiative. And being a least developed country is one of those criteria. So all the least developed countries can apply to Hand-in-Hand. They comply with the criteria, but it has to be the countries the one who ask for us to help them, because this has to be country-led and country-driven. So right now we have 45 countries in total, and I mentioned the ones which are LDCs as part of the Hand-in-Hand initiative. The idea of why we have the criteria behind is we wanted to select the countries which were the poorest and the most vulnerable. So it's least developed countries, least developed landlocked countries, small island development states which are least developed, and countries in food crisis. Those are the countries that can request the support of the Hand-in-Hand initiative and will get the technical support from FAO to implement. Now, the initiative, as I mentioned, is based on territorial approach and is trying to target areas where agriculture has significant potential. And when we refer to agriculture, this is crops, livestock, aquaculture, fisheries, and forestry, of course. And those are areas where FAO will work with the government together to identify those areas, identify the bottlenecks, and try to come up with concrete investment plans where we try to attract, by matchmaking, IFIs, but also private sector to work with the government to resolve those challenges and to move forward. And that's the way we believe we can do the agri-food system transformation, because it will be sustainably moving people out of poverty. To be able to move an individual out of poverty, we need to move from extreme poverty, which is lower than $1.2 a day PPP, to around $7 PPP a day. So we need to multiply that more than 5. That's the only way we will move a household out, an individual out of extreme poverty. And that requires, of course, significant work in trying to release their constraints they face. Now, there are many other activities that FAO does. Hand-in-Hand is one of the initiatives, but there are many other activities that we are doing. And we are also following up to the Food System Summit, working with the country plans and the country transformation process that they are proposing through the dialogues. And that's where we want to also implement and bring together the new strategic framework of FAO, and especially the accelerators of data, innovation, technology, and complements, which are institutions and human capital that are helping us, and governance, of course, that will help us to make this inclusive. Our target is SDG 1, poverty, 2, hunger, and 10, inequalities. And why 10? Because we believe that the only way we can move a household sustainable out of poverty will be by reducing inequalities. And COVID-19 has clearly shown that. So we work at the country level with our country offices, with the resident coordinators, and with the country strategies. So we are very actively in bringing all the UN and non-UN partners into the actions that we do in the countries through Hand-in-Hand or through the other initiatives that we have in place. So partnerships are central around this issue. In terms of the question on the virtual reserves, which is where we work with Joachim von Braun, and that was during the food crisis period in 2017, 2019. Now, that concept that we developed at that point in time was because in that period of time, one of the major problems that were observed was excessive volatility of prices. And we had a very clear definition that came in the G20 of Paris about what excessive volatility means. And excessive volatility was defined by a model that we developed, which was called the next Q, which basically identified when there were cases that there was a 5% probability that that event will occur in terms of excessive volatility. And volatility is changing prices, no? It's not price levels. So in that point in time, excessive volatility was a key problem and was exacerbating the situation of the lack of food, because there we have an issue of supply, which was because of droughts and so on and so forth. And not only that, there was the financialization of the food market, because many of the food commodities became part of the portfolios of investments, and that exacerbated even more the situation. And when you have periods of excessive volatility as defined, then speculation is not good. Speculation becomes bad, and food is a human right. So our argument was that there was a need to have this trigger mechanism and a virtual reserve in parallel that will allow us to resolve that problem. Today, we are not facing that problem. Today, we don't have a period, we don't have excessive volatility. Today, what we have is a significant increase in demand of certain big importing countries, which has moved towards increasing prices. So what we are observing today is price increases, not periods of excessive volatility. In very few cases, for very short periods happen, but it's not what we are observing. Now, the supplies today are good, and AMIs have played a crucial role to reduce any uncertainty about supplies and about the stocks. And that's why during COVID-19, there never was a problem of access to food, or a problem of food availability, sorry. The problem during COVID-19 is a problem of access, meaning countries and people don't have enough resources to buy food. So today, although the tool is there and the next new model keeps running and we can still, and we are using it and we know when there is periods of excessive volatility, the problem today is more on diversifying production. So we have a bigger portfolio of production in the world and exports in the world of staple commodities, which have improved substantially from what happened during the previous food crisis. So Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay has stepped up in the level of supply, which has diversified the portfolio of the countries which are exporting to the world. But it still is not enough. We need to keep increasing that and keep improving on that so that we have a bigger diversified portfolio, because we know that climate change can affect a key exporting country and that will be reflected in prices. On the other hand, we need to find also what is going to happen in terms of the demand of countries because of the recovery plan, which is unequal, and big countries are buying more food, which is putting pressure on the commodity markets. And that's something that a bigger supply will resolve, but we don't have a problem of food availability today. Even if we look at high value commodities, which will be part of what we call healthy diets, we have enough, although not perfect. We can diversify even more, but the world today supplies sufficient food. The problem is distribution of food and food access, because food is not distributed properly, and that's why in the African continent, for example, of the 9 food groups that you need to be able to have access to healthy diets, a significant amount of them are not available, and that's why trade is so important. So the situation today is different. There is only still one problem today, which is really important, is the transportation cost of food, which has increased substantially. And there are 2 reasons why it has increased. On one side, fresh food, which is transported by air, has increased its cost because there is less people flying, and therefore the sharing of the cost is reduced. But on the second hand, there is a huge demand on commodity markets and on containers. We have put some pressure on the transportation of food through ships, and that has increased the cost of transportation, which is reflected also, of course, on the food market. And that's what we also need to tackle, and we are working on having real-time data mobility of food so that countries can understand that they also can diversify and increase their resilience in terms of that. And one of the things that we're launching in November is the new SOFA, the 2021 SOFA, which focus exactly on looking at resilience and trying to have 4 indicators that measure resilience at the country level so that we can understand. And one of those indicators look at transportation costs. And of course, we look at other indicators like, for example, what is the buffer you need in a country to be able to respond to a crisis like COVID-19. And of course, access to food and availability of food. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just thank the 3 panelists for presenting their work and sharing their work with us, and also to Maximo Torero, our keynote speaker. You know, it's not every day you're going to get to hear from the chief economist of the FAO. You know, Maximo is one of the leading experts in the world on agriculture, and we really benefit from having him with us today. He's going to stick around because I'm going to continue with respect to the, you know, we have 3 more coming up. I want to introduce now our 4th panel presentation, Bola Amoke Awotide. I think she's joining us remotely from Canada. She's an agricultural economist who obtained her PhD from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. She's currently a monitoring, evaluation, and learning officer at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Mali. She was actually a PhD intern at UNU Wider here in Helsinki. She has joined us virtually and will present her paper on Do Sahelian Smallholder Farmers Benefit from Adoption of Climate-Smart Agricultural Technologies, an instrumental variable quantile average treatment approach. Now, if you know what a variable quantile average treatment approach is, you're better than me. But she's going to explain to us what that approach is. So I'm going to give her the floor. You have the floor. please. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me, please?
We're hearing you very clearly.
Good morning from Canada. Thank you so much for the introduction. This morning, I just want to briefly share with you a study that has just been concluded, whereby we try to assess if Sahelian smallholder farmers actually benefit from adoption of climate-smart agricultural technologies, and we have adopted the quantile variable, instrumental variable approach. So we all know that in many of the developing countries across the globe, agriculture is quite very paramount, as majority of the population depend on this sector for their survival. And in order to increase the productivity of this sector, it has been found out from the literature that dissemination and adoption of improved technology is key in this regard, particularly for regions that are currently being affected by the climate change. Talking about the Sahelian region, additional effort has also been put in place to develop climate-smart agricultural technologies. And it is believed that the adoption of these technologies will actually mitigate, reduce, or if not eliminate the adverse effect of climate change on these resource-poor farmers. In addition, many studies in the past have also evaluated impact of technologies adoption on various outcomes. But essentially, they have depended on using the mean yield, mean income, and expenditure, without telling us how this impact has been distributed, particularly among the lower quantiles or even the upper quantiles of the distribution. Meanwhile, we also realized that this will be an interesting topic for the policymakers, as their interest will be on assessing whether adoption of this technology actually impacts the lower welfare farmers. So in order to fill in this gap in the literature, we try to look at the empirical distributional impact of adopting agricultural climate-smart technologies on the household welfare of rural farmers in Mali. And we are motivated by the fact that we try to estimate the overall impact of adopting climate-smart technologies on the welfare of the farmers, and also look at the heterogeneity of this impact on the welfare distribution. This study focused essentially on the Sahelian region. And when we talk about the Sahelian region, this is the region that is immediately below the sub-Saharan desert in West Africa. And it's a region that cut across many countries, starting from Mauritania down to Eritrea, and covering about 10 countries. However, we focus mainly on Mali, and Mali is the 8th largest nation in Africa. It is also a landlocked country and one of the poorest countries in the world. More than half of the population of Mali lives in the rural area, and they also depend on agriculture and also for survival. Additionally, currently, this data was collected in 2019, and we adopted a multi-stage random sampling techniques to select the farmers that we use in this analysis. Essentially, we focus on 4 regions in Mali, which is Kaye, Sikasso, Kunikoro, and Ségou region. And from each of the regions, we collected data from 8 communes, making a total of 32 communes from the 4 regions, and a total of 320 villages, and 7 farm households were selected per village, giving us a total of 2,240 households for this analysis. In this study, we focus on outcome, which we call welfare, but capturing welfare is problematic. So we did this by looking at process, and these processes include per capita consumption expenditure. We look at the per capita food expenditure and non-food expenditure. We also look at the per capita household income, and we carry out the analysis on these 4 variables. But as time will not permit me, because of the slide was more than this has to be reduced to this because of time. So I will just present the summary of the findings. We also use a lot of methodologies to arrive at our conclusion. gives of the result for the determinants of adoption of climate smart agricultural technologies. So from the result of the mean difference, which is like an observed impact of the adoption on these outcomes, it shows us that in all the selected welfare indicator variables, we also found out that this adoption on the welfare part is mostly highest for the lower tiers of the per capita food expenditure distribution, and also for some of the other outcomes that we assessed in this study. And adoption of this technology also impact per capita total income of the poorer households substantially. So in conclusion, the adoption of this climate technology is pro-poor, that is, it is much more pronounced on the poor smallholder farmers than the rich ones. And we therefore recommend that this intervention should be scaled up towards the resource poor farm households that are currently facing adverse effects of climate change in Mali. I don't want to close this presentation without acknowledging the donor for this study. This study is currently taking place in 2 countries in West Africa, in the Sahel region. We have Mali and Niger, and it's being funded by the Royal Norway Mali. I also want to say a very big thank you to the national partners, because we are working on this project with collaborating partners like the IER, which is the National Research Institute in Mali, and the non-governmental organizations working with NGOs at the grassroots, enumerators who help us with the data collection. And a very big thank you to the farmers for the time, without which this data this study will not be possible. And to all of you listening to me, thank you so much for your time.
That was very interesting. Thank you, Ms. Awatide. Let me ask you a question. Can you give us a couple of examples of climate-smart agricultural technologies?
Yes, in this study, we focus on the stress tolerance improved varieties, like the early, the extra early varieties, the varieties that are capable of producing even with limited supply of rainfall. We also look at the integrated pest management, and we also look at irrigation and other practices like intercropping and water management techniques, and a whole lot of them that are being introduced to the farmers through this project, and some of them that they already been adopted before the commencement of this climate smart technology project.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to our 5th presenter, who is Mr. Ricardo Santos. He's a UNU Wider Research Fellow, and he's stationed in Maputo, Mozambique. He's a technical advisor to the Center of Economics and Management Studies at the Faculty of Economics of Eduardo Mondlane University. He will virtually present on horizontal and intersecting inequalities in Mozambique from 1997 to 2017. Mr. Santos, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for allowing the presentation of this study. The study was conducted by myself with Eva Maria Egger and Vincenzo Salvucci, and we're conducting this research under a research partnership that joins UNU Wider, also the University of Copenhagen, and then here in Mozambique, where I'm talking from, Universidade Eduardo Mondlane and the Ministry of Finance. And the aim of this study that I'm going to present was to set what were baselines and also current trends in horizontal and intersecting wealth inequalities in the country, and trying to set and to share this information that was a little bit less known within Mozambique, and making the point here that I think you've already heard the name of the country quite a few times in this session. So when we're looking to inequality, first the information and the motivation comes from vertical inequality itself, so measured by either Gini or or an alternative indicator, the generalized entropy. And what we can see in Mozambique is that originally from 1997 to 2007, there was a positive evolution on wealth inequality in Mozambique, but we find some reversal already in the last decade. And what we can see in the second graph is that this is not just an aspect that we find in the country as a whole, but if we look into the various provinces in the country, what we then find is that there is a diversity in the experience, and actually certain provinces, so the province of in this case, the provinces of Manica, Sofala, Inhambane, Gaza, Maputo Provincia, and Maputo Cidade actually have been experiencing a decrease in vertical inequality, while in the other provinces there is an increase in the last decade. And this already raised us a signal of concern that we try to look into. So the group inequalities we look into are around province, so regional and geographic inequalities, around urban and rural divides, and ethno-linguistic identities, the main ethno-linguistic identity in each of the households. We use data from the censuses from 1997, 2007, 2017, and we look into assets of household assets as measured by the multidimensional poverty index that is used in the country for measuring multidimensional poverty, and it has been used in the two poverty assessments, the most recent, but also the previous one in 2014-15. So these are the ones that we use to assess wealth in each of the households, and then that's what we use to measure inequality. So what we see here and what we show here is that when we focus on group inequality and intersecting inequalities, it's a little bit more worrisome what we find. And specifically, we do find a clearer increase in the role of between group inequality, so the share of between group inequality and total inequality. And we see that more prevalent across the country. So not only at measuring in Mozambique as a whole, but then in most of the provinces other than Maputo Provincia and Maputo Cidade. For those that don't know Mozambique as strongly, Maputo is the capital of the country. It's in the southernmost. It's one of the southernmost provinces, and together with Maputo Provincia actually has the most urbanized area in the country. So when we look into ethno-linguistic inequalities, we also see again and once again this clear signal that there is an increase of ethno-linguistic inequalities, and the weight of inter-ethno-linguistic groups inequality in most of the provinces and also the country, but that's not felt in the southernmost and most notably in the capital. So the first insights that we find from analyzing and decomposing inequality, but also from a regression that we conduct and present in our paper, is that the urban-rural decoupling added to low internal migration has a significant role in these and what we are identifying as the increase of group inequality and intersecting inequalities. We also find an apparent worsening in the average condition of all other ethno-linguistic groups when they compare to Xixangana and Portuguese speakers. For clarity, Xixangana is the most prevalent ethno-linguistic group in the southernmost provinces of Maputo Provincia, Maputo Cidade, and Gaza. And Portuguese speakers are now, it's now a group that usually identifies multi-ethnical Mozambican families. So when families are made up from Mozambicans from two different ethno-linguistic groups, they tend to speak Portuguese, and their offsprings end up speaking Portuguese and identifying themselves with that ethno-linguistic group. So to clarify, these are not former colonial residents in Mozambique. These are actually Mozambicans that speak Portuguese as a mother language. The underlying risk, however, is that there is a narrative that can be built along these differences. So the urban-rural difference and also this ethno-linguistic difference. And historically, there are indications that this is the case. So Renamo used anti-Xishangana, anti-Shangana sentiment to foster support, especially in the central provinces and northern provinces. And some of the aspects that we're finding in the fights in Cabo Delgado that have been attacking and then scourging Mozambique right now, they have been there's also evidence that there is an anti-Maconde sentiment amongst the Moani, and these are two linguistic groups that are from Cabo Delgado only, where Maconde is more linked with the current government. And so there's a mix between ethno-linguistic and anti-governmental grievances that can be there. So first, preliminary reflections and policy implications. So first of all, it's important to note that these are insights from correlates. There's no causal inference that can be made from the analysis. However, the differences that we find in average wealth between groups, if perceived, may feed grievances. And they should be better understood so that the underlying causes can be addressed. From what we saw so far, there's already two possible guidelines for possible policy implications. One of them is that if provinces with a more advanced pace in urbanization are experiencing a virtuous evolution in wealth inequality, as we saw and as we depicted in our analysis, then the possible policy can be